Hi folks, and welcome back to the Advantage Applications channel. My name's Rich, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of exporting your data from Access to Excel when you want to analyze it instead of using the intrinsic reporting tools in Access. And one of the ways that I like to do this is to have a ready-made form for the users in Access where they can define some reporting query parameters. Then they click a button and that data is going to get exported to an existing Excel document that already has some pivot tables and pivot charts built into it. Once that exported data hits that Excel file, those charts and tables update automatically and open on the user's desktop. And don't forget, if you would like to have access to the source code and files that I use in all of these videos, there'll be a link in the description where you can become a member to the channel, and you'll get a link to the Google Drive where I store those things. You can download them for your own purposes, whether it's just a study or practice, or if you want to use them for springboard code in your own projects. So anyway, there are probably a few different ways to accomplish this. I'm going to show you the way that I do it and that I found works best for me. Before we jump right into the details of how to do this, I want to give you an overview of what the main steps will be. We'll have our data in a table in Access. Of course, this could be a link table pointing to another data source like SharePoint or SQL Server. And in a real-world scenario, our data would probably be spread across multiple tables. But that's okay because that's where the second component comes in. And that's our query that acts as the view of the data that we'll be analyzing in Excel. So if our data is distributed across multiple tables, this query will be what brings it all together into a single record set. Finally, we'll have a form that will allow our users to define a few quick parameters to narrow down the data that's actually sent to Excel. We'll use these parameters that the user enters to update the query definition. And if you aren't quite sure what that means, don't worry, we'll go through it in detail in just a bit. The Excel file that we create will store a connection to our Access database, and it'll use that connection to refresh pivot tables and pivot charts that we build into this workbook as well. Okay, those are the broad strokes. Now let's get into the details. The data we're going to use for this example is just some free stuff I found online about video game sales. So now we want to create our query that's going to view all of this data for us. And before we worry about the form and how it's going to affect the query definition, we're just going to make the query so that it selects all of the records in this table. And there we go. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this as QRY analyze in Excel. Okay, now let's take a look at the form that we're going to use to let users define parameters so that they can send a subset of the data to Excel to analyze to begin with. So I already have this form created. And rather than make you guys watch me write code the whole time, I'm just going to go through it step by step. But basically the way that it works is I have a few combo boxes on the form where users can make selections. And then they can click a button, and that's going to change the query definition in this query here so that it's limited to whatever the parameters were that the user provided. Okay, so the bulk of the code behind this form is all in the button click event here. And the first thing I do is dimension some variables, and the first one is Excel app, which is going to be an Excel application. The next one is a workbook variable that is defined as a workbook, and then a query definition. Then I set my query definition variable to be the query that we just created, query analyze in Excel. Then I make that query's SQL property equal to whatever is returned from this function that we're going to go through right now, because it's what does the heavy lifting. And that function name is getSQL. Of course, you can name it whatever you like. And this is the function. Okay, so the first thing I do in this code is to dimension a variable that's going to contain our SQL string. And next I dimension another string variable that's going to hold our where clause. And the reason I split those between two different string variables is because we're going to build the where clause independent of the main SQL string, and it's going to be based on whatever parameters the user selects in our form. Okay, so I go ahead and assign a general select statement to our string SQL variable, and it's just going to select all of the records from that table. And then I'll make string where clause just an empty string for right now until we can test those parameters on the form. And I use pretty much the same format to test each of the controls on that form. And I know in general they say it's bad coding practice if you catch yourself copying and pasting code, which is pretty much what I did here throughout this function. But to me, efficiency sometimes means you trade off readability. And I wanted to keep this code as simple as possible to understand in case any of the members of my channel download it and they want to adapt it to their own uses. And besides, it's not a whole lot, and I think it's going to work just fine this way. Okay, so let's go over this first condition here. I say if not is null CBO publisher. So that's basically saying if CBO publisher has a value selected in it, then we're going to have to adapt our string where clause to consider that parameter. So if that condition evaluates to true, we're going to enter into this inner if statement here. And now we have to test to see if where clause is already empty. And since this is the very first test of a combo box in our form, if this evaluates to true, this will always evaluate to true. So it looks a little unnecessary for this test to actually be in here for the first control that we test. But I try to keep everything uniformed so that this one is the same as this one, is the same as the next one. And that's so if I end up adding a new control ahead of CBO publisher on the form, so in other words, if in my form I put a new combo box ahead of this one for something, say developer for instance, then I don't have to change the code here anymore. I can just plug in a new condition right on top of this one and it's going to work fine. Okay, so if our where clause is empty at this point, then all I need to worry about plugging into string where clause is the SQL that would test that the field publisher is equal to whatever value the user selected in CBO publisher on the form. If string where clause already had a value in it, then I would need to set string where clause equal to whatever is already in string where clause and add this and operator at the beginning of the SQL that tests that the field publisher is equal to the combo box publisher on the form. And that makes more sense and becomes absolutely necessary as we go down our code. And I'll step through this in a minute too to make it a little more clear. Okay, so now we're going to test the second combo box, which is console, on our form for a value. And we're going to say if not is null, CBO console again. So basically we're saying if it's not null, if it contains a value, then we step into this inner if statement. And now, assuming let's say that publisher did have a value and we've already assigned something to string where clause, then this would evaluate to false because string where clause would already have a value. So the else condition would be what plays out. And now we would take whatever exists in string where clause, which would be this information right here, and we're going to make string where clause equal to whatever is that value, and we're going to append this SQL to it to make sure that console or the field console is equal to whatever the user selects in CBO console on the form. And we do that exact same thing again for genre. And the date is just a little different, of course, because rather than testing a single value in a combo box, we have to look at two values and consider the dates between. So let's say that string where clause evaluated to empty. Let's say the user was only interested in setting a date filter on that parameter form. At this point, string where clause would evaluate to empty. So to assign our value to string where clause, we would say that the field release date needs to be between the value in txt date from on the form and txt date to on the form. So it makes sense. We're just making sure that all the data that we grab is going to fall between, as far as the field release date is concerned, it's going to fall between whatever the user entered for text date from and text date to. If string where clause would have already had a value in it, in other words, if a user would have selected something out of one or more of the combo boxes above it, then we would just follow the same format as above, where we take string where clause and assign it to whatever is already in string where clause, and then use the AND operator before we append our date parameter. If string where clause is not empty, in other words, if the user has selected or set some parameters on the form, then we're going to take string where clause and add the where clause operator right in front of that string where clause value. So then at the end here, we're going to take whatever the value is in string SQL, which is just a general select statement for all of the records in our table. We're going to concatenate the where clause onto it. And if this is an empty string, well, then this is still just a general select statement, so that's all that gets returned. But if it has the parameters, then that's going to be appended to this, and all of that is going to get returned in the function. Okay, now let's actually step through that so it can be more clear. I'll go ahead and put a stop in the code here. I'll go to our user form, and I'll go ahead and click Analyze in Excel with the parameters that we've already set. Okay, there is our stop. And now let's just start stepping through. So first we're going to assign this value to our string SQL variable. Then we're going to set string where clause to an empty string. All right, the first test is for CBO Publisher, and we know that we did make a selection in there, and if I hover over it, I will be able to see that it is Activision. So this first test will test to true. It is not null. Then at this point, the string where clause should be empty, so this should also evaluate to true, and it does. So now our string where clause is going to hold where publisher equals whatever's in CBO Publisher. And now we go on to the next one for console. And again, console does have a value of PS4. I'm going to step through that. That evaluates to true. But this time, string where clause is not an empty string. It actually contains a value. So this is going to evaluate to false, and then the else condition will execute. And so now we're going to take whatever is in string where clause already, and we're going to append the AND statement along with the test to see if field console is equal to CBO console. And there we go. So if I were to view that down here in the immediate window, we see what we have so far, where publisher equals Activision and console equals PS4. And since these are text fields, they are enclosed in single quotes, by the way. All right, let's keep stepping through. CBO genre, I believe we left blank, and it looks like it is null. So this should evaluate to false and skip this condition entirely, and it does. Now it's going to consider the dates that we've selected, and since we did have date values in there, this is going to evaluate to true. And since string where clause does already have values, this is going to evaluate to false, and the else statement is going to execute. And now if we play through that and look at this again in the immediate window, we see that our where clause is more fleshed out now. We have publisher equals Activision and console equals PS4, and release date is between 8/21/2014 and 8/21/2024. Okay, now the final condition is string where clause not equal to empty. That's going to evaluate to true. So now we're going to put that very important where statement right at the beginning of our where clause variable. And now finally, when we look at it down here, we have an actual where clause. Now it's going to put all of that together and return it as this function's value. And what we've done in the meantime is that query that I just created a second ago, where it would select all the records in that table, we've just updated its definition so that its SQL matches what the SQL is that was just returned from that function. So now if I were to go back to our navigation panel and run that query, it's only going to show the records that match the criteria that we just passed it. Okay, so now how do we get all this into Excel? Well, first we create a blank workbook. Then we want to establish a data connection to that query that we created in our Access database. So to do that, we go up to the Data menu. Then we choose Get Data from the ribbon. And we want this from a database, and it's going to be an Access database, of course. Then we're going to browse out to the Access database that we want to use. Once the connection is established, we're going to be able to choose from tables or queries that reside in our database. In this case, we just want to link to Query Analyze in Excel. We get a preview of our data to make sure we're in the right one. And now I'm just going to click Load. And our data loads right into Excel, and it's formatted as a table already for us. I'm going to go ahead and change the name of the worksheet that it resides in. I'm just going to call it Data. And that's pretty useful already because in my experience, most of my users like to work with data in Excel instead of Access. It makes it easier for them to share and kind of run their own reports and filters on. But another thing I like to do in these workbooks is to go ahead and build in some pivot charts and pivot tables for them to look at data in ways that I already know that they're probably going to want to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and click Sheet 1 here. And with cell A1 already selected, I'm going to go ahead and insert a pivot chart with a pivot table. In the dialog box that pops up, I'm going to select Use an External Data Source and then choose Connection. And here we see the connection that we just established a second ago to query analyze in Excel. So I select that and click Open. And I'm going to go ahead and put the data in the existing worksheet that we're on. I click OK. And I get the container for a pivot table and a pivot chart. So now, just to kind of give them something to start from, I'm going to go ahead and select a few fields for them to review. We'll just use genre as a filter to start off with. We'll use title as our row. And we'll look at total sales as our calculated value. And I can rename this worksheet then to Total Sales by Title. And we can make as many of these as we thought would be useful to our users as just kind of a starting point. And what I tend to do is whenever I roll out a front end, I'll roll out this dynamic report Excel template with that front end as well, so that each user has their own version of it. That way, if they want to build onto the workbook by adding their own pivot tables and pivot charts in there, if they want to modify any of the existing pivot tables or pivot charts, they can do that as well. And if they mess it up or they get to a point where they need to re-download it, then the master copy is out there on the network for them to do that, either on a file share or a SharePoint site. And to make it really easy for them, a lot of times in my databases, I'll even put a button on there that they can re-download this Excel workbook by just clicking that button. Okay, so now let's give it a try for real. Let's go back to the Data tab, and you can see here we only have 4 records under the parameters that we selected a moment ago. So now if I go back into the database here, and let's change it up a little bit. We're not going to specify a publisher. We will still use a console. I'll use the Xbox 360. Use that same broad date range. Hold on. There we go. And for genre, we'll try shooter. And now if I click Analyze in Excel, that updates our query def. And here, of course, to make this more user-friendly, we could actually open the workbook for the users as well. Maybe we'll do that in just a second just to round it out. But now if I go to my workbook and I choose Data and refresh all, we see that it refreshes the data and it has the Xbox 360 in here as a result. But that's not really a good example because it only returned 1 record. Let's try another. We'll leave this parameter blank as well this time just to see what we get. I click Analyze Data, back to my Excel workbook, refresh all, and now we get a few more on the Xbox 360. And if I look over at my pivot chart and pivot table, they've automatically updated as well. So it's pretty simple and it's pretty handy, and it lets your users get a more dynamic way that they can look at their data, because at any point here now, if there are other points of data, other ways that they want to look at this, they could modify the pivot table and pivot chart. Okay, so to round it out, let's go ahead and look at how we could open this workbook automatically right from our Access database. I'm going to save this workbook in the exact same folder location as the front end file of my Access database. And I'm just going to name it Game Data. And it's really important to know exactly where your workbook resides in order to launch it from Access. And one of the ways that I address that is by programming my application's front ends to self-install. And I've actually got a video on that. If you haven't checked that out, you might want to look at that if you plan to launch this kind of Excel analysis workbook right from your database, because it's a way to kind of guarantee your files are where you expect them to be. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and close this, and let's go into our database. Get back into the code for that Analyze in Excel button. Okay, and we already have some code up here to dimension variables for our Excel application and workbook. I'm going to go ahead and make one for our worksheet as well. That way we can select which worksheet we want to activate as soon as the user opens this file up. Okay, and one thing that's really important too if you're going to interface with Excel from your Access application is to make sure you have a reference to Excel. To do that, you can go up into Tools and select References right from your code editor. And I already have it selected here, but it's Microsoft Excel 16 Object Library for my installation of Office. And of course, you may have to scroll down the list here to find it. But once that's selected and checked, you can go ahead and write some code against it. And we'll put it down here at the bottom because we want our query def to have been updated, obviously, before we open that Excel workbook. Okay, and the code for that is to set Excel app equal to create object. We're going to pass it a string parameter, and it's just going to be Excel dot application. Okay, now we need to set our workbook object, so we just come down here and say set Excel WB equals Excel app. We can reference that application object now, workbooks.open. And now here's where it's important to know the path of your workbook. And since we already know where our file resides in this instance, and if you use the self-installer code that I show you in my previous video, you'll know where your file is too. We can use this object and its property to get that first part of the path. And that is application.currentproject.path. And now we can just concatenate the file name onto that. Okay, and once our workbook is open, we will want to open the worksheet that we want the viewer to see first. So we're going to set our XLWS variable equal to XLWB.worksheets data. Now, once that workbook opens and it displays the correct worksheet, we want to go ahead and free up the memory explicitly in our code here. We don't want to close the workbook, but we're going to set all of these object variables to nothing now. So I say set Excel app equals nothing, and I do the same for the others. Obviously, if we were still going to interface with those objects, we wouldn't set them to nothing until after we've written any code against them that we want to use. All right, let's go ahead and test that now. Save my changes, close out of the code window. Make a different selection here, a couple different parameters. Click Analyze in Excel, and it looks like nothing happens. So let's see what is going on in the code there. I believe I know what might be wrong. Go back into the code for the button. And we did not make that visible, so we want to make that visible right now. So we'll say Excel app.visible equals true. And once I set that object to the data worksheet, I forgot to actually activate it. So we'll say XLWS.activate, and now that should get us where we want to be. Let's change this up again. I don't know how far back our data goes, but I'm just experimenting here. Okay, we come into data, refresh all. And we see that our data now updates to what the query def was for the parameters that we selected. And we could even write that in the code too to automatically update all of the data points. So let's actually go ahead and do that. We can save or not save the workbook. That's fine either way. Come into the code, and that is going to happen with the workbook object. So we'll say xlwb.refresh all. Okay, save that change. Switch this. We'll try Capcom. Analyze in Excel. And when our workbook opens, now the publisher is now Capcom. And we can see our pivot table and our pivot chart has updated as well. So there we go. It is a little bit of coding, but honestly, it's a pretty slick solution for people who don't want to just view static canned reports in Access, but want to be able to look at things in Excel where it's more easily shareable and easily modified if they want to massage the data a little bit differently than what the report might already have as a default. So that's it. I hope you found this information useful, and if you do, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to continue to make videos on real-world Access, and pretty soon I'm going to bring in some information on how to bolt on Power Apps to your Access applications as well. Take care.